He laughed while I cried. Actually laughed, a real, genuine laugh, right there in our kitchen, the one I'd spent 3 weekends painting sage green for his 35th birthday. She sat on our marble counter wearing my vintage Chloe silk shirt, the one he'd given me for our anniversary, her legs swinging like a child without a care in the world. "Ruth, you're being dramatic," Daniel said, zipping his pants with deliberate slowness, his voice carrying that familiar tone of condescension I'd learned to recognize over 6 years of marriage. "It's not what you think." But I could see what I thought was right there on his collar, lipstick the color of sin, smeared against his neck. Not my shade. Never my shade. And her perfume, that cloying mix of jasmine and desperation, hung in the air like a curse. The worst part? I recognized it. I'd bought that exact bottle, thinking it was for me, thinking it was a gift. He'd given it to her instead. She giggled, actually giggled, and I felt something inside me crystallize. "I told you she'd find out eventually," Madeline said, her 25-year-old face glowing with the arrogance of youth and infidelity. "You said you'd tell her." Daniel turned to me then, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't remorse or panic or shame. It was pity. Pure, distilled pity, as though I were a small child who'd caught him with her hand in the cookie jar and didn't understand that he was allowed to have cookies whenever he wanted. "You're making this worse than it needs to be," he said quietly, that manipulator's tone I'd heard 1,000 times before, the one that made me second-guess my own sanity. "She means nothing. You're overreacting, as usual." My hands shook. My vision blurred. My heart felt like it was trying to escape my chest. But I smiled. And in that smile was everything he taught me to hide. "You'll never survive without me," he whispered, stepping closer, his hand reaching for my arm like he could comfort me into compliance. "You know that, right? You need me." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man I'd loved, the man I'd built a life around, the man who'd convinced me that his cruelty was care. And I whispered back, "Watch me. My name is Ruth Elena Carter, and for 6 years, I gave everything to a man who was systematically deconstructing my sense of self." Daniel Michael Cole was charming in the way that narcissists always are, confident without humility, intelligent without wisdom, and incapable of genuine love. He was a financial advisor at Mercer and Associates, making 6 figures, driving a Tesla, and collecting compliments like other men collected watches. We met at a charity gala. I was working as a graphic designer then, and he approached me at the bar with a line so smooth I should have known it was dangerous. "You're too beautiful to be standing alone," he'd said, and I, foolish and lonely, had melted. 6 months later, we were engaged. 12 months later, we were married in his parents' garden, and I was already becoming someone I didn't recognize. It happened so gradually that I didn't notice the erosion until I was already worn smooth by it. He'd correct the way I spoke in front of his colleagues. "Ruth, utilize isn't really the right word choice there, is it?" His tone would be light, amused, but his eyes would be cold, and everyone would laugh along with him. He'd dismiss my ideas in meetings. "That's sweet, baby, but you're thinking too small. That's why you're a designer and not running a company." And he'd say it while squeezing my shoulder, making it seem like affection instead of contempt. He'd tell me I was too sensitive, too emotional, too much, and then he'd withhold affection until I apologized for having feelings. Every time I caught him in a lie, he'd twist it until I was the one apologizing. "You always do this," he'd say, wrapping his arms around me from behind while I stood frozen. "You always look for problems that don't exist. It's why you'll never be truly happy, Ruth. You sabotage yourself. You sabotage us." And I'd believe him. God help me, I believed him. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Morrison, a kind woman with silver hair and intelligent eyes. But Daniel convinced me that therapy was making me paranoid and unreasonable. After 3 months, I quit. I stopped having lunch with my best friend, Claire, because Daniel said she was a bad influence and didn't understand our dynamic. I rarely saw my mother, because he complained that she was judgmental about our relationship. By the time Madeline arrived in his office, I was already isolated, already convinced that I was the problem, already half dissolved. She was 25, with the kind of beauty that comes from never having been told no, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having experienced real consequences. Daniel brought her home 3 times before I understood what was happening. The first time, she was just the new assistant, brilliant girl, going places. The second time, she was helping with a project. By the third time, I could feel the shift in the air like a storm coming. He started working late. Then later. Then not coming home at all. When I asked him where he was, he'd say things like, "The market doesn't stop for your insecurity, Ruth," or, "I'm building something important, and I need focus. Your paranoia isn't helping." I remember the exact moment I knew. It was a Tuesday in March, 3 years into our marriage. I decided to surprise him with dinner, his favorite, osso buco, and I drove into his office to pick him up at 8 p.m. I saw them in the parking garage. She was pressed against the wall of his BMW, her dress halfway undone, his hands in places they had no business being. When he saw me, he didn't look guilty. He looked annoyed, like I'd interrupted something trivial. "Ruth," he'd said, pulling away from her as though that made it better. "This isn't what it looks like." The most cliched lie in the book, and yet I wanted so desperately to believe him. "What does it look like?" I'd asked, my voice steady even as my world was collapsing. He'd straightened his tie, looked at me with that familiar pity, and said, "It looks like you're being hysterical again." I drove home alone. The osso buco spoiled in the car. 6 weeks later, I came home early from a client meeting to find them in my kitchen. Not his kitchen. My kitchen. The one I'd designed, the one I'd renovated, the one that had been my refuge. I still don't remember the exact details of the argument that followed. I remember screaming. I remember him being so calm it was terrifying. I remember Madeline looking uncomfortable, and somehow that made it worse, that she had the grace to be embarrassed while he had none. When I demanded he leave, he smiled, actually smiled, and said, "Fine. But understand this, Ruth, no one will ever love you like I do. And no one will ever put up with your crazy like I have." He moved out 2 days later. But he didn't move alone. Madeline went with him. And then he went public with a narrative I couldn't have anticipated even in my worst nightmares. He told everyone, his colleagues, our mutual friends, his family, anyone who would listen, that I was unstable. That I'd become paranoid and obsessive. That I'd threatened him. He even fabricated a series of text messages that supposedly came from me, sent them to our friends as a proof that I was losing it. He took half the money from our joint account. He took the car. He took my beloved golden retriever, Murphy, saying I wasn't stable enough to care for him properly. And the worst part? People believed him. Because Daniel had that kind of charm, the kind that smiled while it lied. The kind that made you want to protect him from a crazy ex-wife. I became the villain in my own story. For 3 months, I barely left my apartment. I cried. I slept. I stopped answering calls from the few friends who still tried to reach out. I lost 15 pounds. My mother wanted me to move home. My brother wanted me to take legal action. Dr. Morrison, whom I'd started seeing again in secret, wanted me to consider medication. And then one morning, I woke up and realized something fundamental had shifted inside me. The pain was still there, that sharp, constant ache of betrayal, but underneath it was something else. Something quieter. Something harder. Rage, maybe. Or clarity. I got out of bed. I showered. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw not a broken woman, but a woman who'd been broken by someone else's hands. And I made myself a promise, if Daniel wanted to see what crazy really looked like, I'd show him. Beautifully. Methodically. Perfectly. I enrolled in a night course at the community college in digital forensics. The professor, a woman named Dr. Keisha Williams with brilliant eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, seemed unsurprised when I told her I was taking it, for personal reasons. Good reasons, she'd asked. The best, I'd replied. She smiled and handed me the syllabus. For the next 8 months, I became someone new. I learned how to trace hidden accounts and uncover deleted messages. I learned how to follow money trails that people thought were invisible. I learned how to access cloud backups and recover supposedly destroyed files. And I learned patience, the kind of patience that comes from knowing that the best revenge is one served ice cold and perfectly calculated. All while I played the part of the devastated ex-wife. I posted quotes about healing on Instagram. I went to grief counseling, at least the part where I could be seen going. I even smiled sadly when mutual friends would check in on me, accepting their pity like it was currency I could spend on my recovery. Meanwhile, in my apartment, surrounded by 3 computer monitors and endless spreadsheets, I was building something. A case. Because in my research, in my digging, I discovered something that changed everything. Daniel wasn't just cheating. He was stealing. It took me 6 months of careful work to uncover the full scope of his fraud. He'd been embezzling from Mercer and Associates for at least 3 years. Small amounts at first, $50,000 here, $75,000 there, transferred to shell accounts, hidden under the names of fake clients and investment portfolios that didn't exist. But then it got bigger. He'd been using client funds, retirement accounts, college savings, investment portfolios from people who trusted him to manage their financial futures, to cover his tracks. When audits came close, he'd falsify documents. When discrepancies appeared, he'd create fake transactions to balance them out. It was intricate. It was criminal. And it was completely documented. The files were stored on a private server that he thought was secure. But Daniel had always underestimated me. He'd always assumed that my crazy meant incompetent. It didn't. I found everything, 17 years of financial manipulation, 23 separate client accounts he'd raided, and a specific trail of money that led directly from Mercer and Associates to his personal accounts, to his Tesla, to the apartment he'd rented for himself and Madeline. By November, exactly 1 year after that night in the kitchen, I had everything I needed. I also had something else, recordings. 2 years prior, Daniel had installed a security system in our home. He'd done it for safety, he'd said, but I'd always suspected it was for control. What he hadn't realized was that I knew the password. After he left, I'd accessed the cloud backup. And there it was. The night he'd come home drunk after being with Madeline. The night he'd screamed at me for ruining him by asking him where he'd been. The night he'd called me worthless, told me no one would ever love me, laughed while I cried. Every word. Every cruel syllable. Saved forever. I had my proof. Now I needed my moment. He called me on a Tuesday in November, exactly 1 year after our separation. "Ruth, it's Daniel." As if I wouldn't recognize his voice. As if it hadn't haunted my nightmares for 12 months. "Hi," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "I need a favor. I can't find some of the old business files on the company server, and I have a meeting with a new investor tomorrow. I think I left some documents in that external drive you used to use. Could you possibly send them over? I know it's asking a lot, but..." I smiled. "Of course, Daniel. I'd be happy to help." I could almost hear the relief in his silence. He'd expected me to refuse, to be difficult, to still be broken. "The files are in my email," he continued. "I'll send you a list of what I need." "Perfect," I said sweetly. "I'll get them right to you." I hung up the phone and opened my laptop. Because I was going to send him exactly what he asked for, and so much more. I spent 3 hours organizing the documents. First, I gathered every file he'd requested, all legitimate, all innocent, nothing that would raise suspicion. I even organized them neatly into folders with clear labels. And then, in a separate folder marked Addendum Recent Updates, I added everything else. The forged financial reports. The falsified client statements. The email chains where he and his comptroller, a woman named Patricia who'd already been questioned in the initial investigation, discussed how to creatively account for discrepancies. The transaction histories showing money flowing from client accounts to his personal use. The fabricated paperwork designed to cover the trail. The communications with Madeline, cheerfully discussing the trips and expenses he was paying for with stolen funds. I titled the email, "Hey, Daniel, found these with the files. You might need them for the meeting." And I sent it not to his personal email, but to his work email, the one that went directly to the company's server, which was monitored. Then I waited. And then I did something else. I forwarded the exact same files to 3 people, the CEO of Mercer and Associates, the company's chief financial officer, and the head of their audit committee. My subject line was simple, urgent, financial discrepancies requiring immediate investigation. In the body of the email, I wrote, "Dear members of the Mercer and Associates leadership, I am writing to report serious financial irregularities that have come to my attention. The attached documents detail systematic embezzlement spanning multiple years, involving the misappropriation of client funds totaling approximately $847,000. These irregularities involve Daniel Cole, senior financial advisor, and appear to involve the falsification of records and the unauthorized use of client accounts. I am providing these documents in the interest of protecting the company's clients and maintaining the integrity of your firm. I recommend immediate investigation and audit. Respectfully, Ruth Carter." I hit send at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. And then I went to bed with the best sleep I'd had in a year. The first sign that something was wrong came when Daniel's car disappeared from the parking lot of his apartment building. The second sign came when Madeline's Instagram went dark. The third sign came when the police showed up at his door. I didn't hear about it directly. I heard about it through the grapevine, through Claire, who'd reached out tentatively, wondering if I was okay, saying she'd heard something about Daniel and the firm. Through my mother, who'd seen something on a local news feed. Through a mutual acquaintance who'd mentioned, casually, that there was an investigation. 2 weeks later, it was official. The SEC had launched a formal investigation into Daniel Cole and Mercer and Associates. Preliminary findings suggested systematic fraud spanning 7 years and involving multiple compromised client accounts. The company had suspended Daniel pending the outcome of the investigation. 3 other employees were also under scrutiny. 1 week later, criminal charges were filed. Fraud. Embezzlement. Falsification of financial records. Wire fraud. Money laundering. The kind of charges that don't result in probation. Daniel was arrested on a Wednesday morning, leaving his apartment building in handcuffs, with his lawyer making no comment to the assembled media. I watched the news clip 3 times, and each time, I felt nothing. Or rather, I felt everything: relief, satisfaction, vindication, but it was all so clean, so bloodless, so perfectly executed that it barely registered as emotion. It registered as justice. He tried to contact me from jail. The first call, I didn't answer. The second, I didn't answer. By the third, I decided I was ready. "Ruth," he said, and his voice was different now, smaller, less certain, stripped of its manipulative charm. "Ruth, I need your help. I need you to tell them this was all a misunderstanding." "You know I didn't." "Didn't what?" I interrupted, my voice steady and cold. "Didn't cheat? Didn't steal? Didn't manipulate me into believing I was crazy?" "I made mistakes," he said quickly, desperately. "I know I did. But this is..." "Ruth, they're talking about 15 years. 15 years. "Yes," I said. "They are. You have to help me. You're the only one who..." "Who what?" "Who knows the truth." "I do know the truth, Daniel. The truth is that you're a thief and a liar, and I have 17 years of documentation to prove it." There was silence on the other end. "Then, you did this." It wasn't a question. "No," I said quietly. "You did this." I just held up the mirror. I hung up the phone. He never called again. What I didn't expect was for Madeline to reach out to me. But 3 weeks after Daniel's arrest, she did. She showed up at my apartment building, looking diminished, makeup-free, hollow-eyed, wearing clothes that didn't fit quite right. I almost didn't recognize her. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. I almost said no. Instead, I said, "Come in." She sat on my couch like she was afraid it would hurt, and she told me everything. How Daniel had pursued her relentlessly. How he'd promised her that he'd leave me, that we were already basically separated, that I was unstable, and holding him back. How he'd slowly introduced her to the embezzlement scheme, making her feel like they were partners, conspirators, a team against the world. How he'd used her the exact same way he'd used me, with charm and manipulation and the careful construction of a lie so beautiful it felt like love. I didn't know, she said, tears streaming down her face. I genuinely didn't know about the extent of the fraud. Daniel told me the money was from his own accounts, from his savings and bonuses. I was stupid and young and I believed him. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because you deserve to know that you weren't crazy," she said. "Because I'm sorry. And because he showed me recordings of you. Of that night. He told me you were abusive, that you were the problem. But then I heard the actual recordings during the investigation, and I realized." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. "He used me the same way he used you," she whispered. I looked at this young woman, broken, remorseful, devastated, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly. But something close to it. "He did," I said. "But that wasn't your fault. And it wasn't mine either." She looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "What do we do now?" "We survive," I said. "We heal. We become better versions of ourselves. And we never let anyone convince us that our sanity depends on their validation again." She nodded slowly. "Do you know what the worst part was?" she asked. "After I realized what he'd done, after I realized I was complicit, he didn't apologize. He just said, 'You'll be fine. You're young. You'll move on.' Like none of it mattered. Like I didn't matter." "He says that to everyone," I replied. "And it's a lie. You do matter." I mattered. Everyone he destroyed mattered. Madeline stayed for 2 hours. Before she left, she hugged me, a genuine, desperate hug, and said, "Thank you for not destroying me back." "I'm not interested in destruction," I said. "I'm interested in truth. And truth is destructive enough on its own." After she left, I realized I meant it. The anger that had fueled me for so long, the beautiful, calculated rage, it had evaporated the moment I'd achieved its purpose. What remained was something quieter. Stronger. More durable. It was called peace. Daniel's trial was scheduled for 8 months later. I was called as a witness by the prosecution. I testified for 2 hours, presenting evidence of the financial fraud, the falsified documents, the systematic embezzlement. I spoke clearly. I spoke truthfully. I spoke without anger or vindication in my voice. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a scorned woman seeking revenge. But the numbers didn't lie. The documents didn't lie. The 17 years of carefully documented fraud didn't lie. Daniel was convicted on 7 counts of federal fraud and 3 counts of money laundering. He was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. Madeline agreed to cooperate with the investigation and received immunity in exchange for testimony. She eventually took a job at a nonprofit helping fraud victims. Patricia, the comptroller who'd helped Daniel falsify records, took a plea deal and was sentenced to 4 years. Mercer and Associates underwent a complete audit. They reformed their oversight procedures, implemented new safeguards, and reimbursed all affected clients. And I moved on. 6 months after Daniel's conviction, I started something new. I was sitting in a coffee shop, reading an article about financial abuse and emotional manipulation, when something crystallized. I had a skill. I had a story. I had a perspective that could help people who felt exactly the way I'd felt. So I started an organization called Second Rise. It began small, just me, a therapist named Dr. Morrison, and a lawyer named James Chen who'd been appalled by the lack of resources for people leaving emotionally abusive relationships. We offered free counseling, legal consultations, financial planning services, and something equally important, community. We didn't judge. We didn't ask why they'd stayed. We didn't wonder why they hadn't seen the red flags. We just offered a hand and said, "You're not crazy. You were never crazy. And you can survive this." Within a year, we'd helped 47 women and 3 men rebuild their lives. Within 2 years, we'd expanded to 2 other cities. Within 5 years, we had a waiting list. I never spoke publicly about Daniel. The trial records were public, so anyone could find the information if they looked. But I didn't need to tell my story as a weapon anymore. I told it as a mirror, so other people could see themselves and understand that survival was possible. 7 years after his conviction, I got a letter. It came to my office at Second Rise, forwarded through the prison mail system. The envelope was stamped with the federal prison logo. I almost threw it away. Instead, I opened it. His handwriting had changed, become smaller, more careful, less confident. "Ruth," it began. "I've written this letter 100 times and deleted it 100 times. I don't expect you to read it. I don't expect you to care. But I needed to try. I'm not going to apologize. I've learned in therapy, yes, they make me do therapy here, that my apologies were always about manipulating you into forgiving me, not about genuine remorse. So instead, I'm going to state facts. I cheated on you. I lied to you. I gaslit you. I isolated you. I stole from you. I stole from my clients. I stole from everyone who trusted me. And then I lied about it and tried to make you seem crazy to cover my tracks. You didn't deserve any of it. You were never the problem. You were right about everything, and I convinced you that you were wrong. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know that somewhere in here, in this cell, I finally figured out what took me 35 years on the outside to learn. I was the crazy one. Not you. And you were right to leave. I hope you're happy. I hope you're free. Daniel." I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it in a drawer and didn't think about it for a week. When I finally did think about it, I realized that it didn't matter whether his apology was genuine or another manipulation. What mattered was that I'd already healed. I'd already moved on. His words, whether sincere or strategic, couldn't hurt me anymore. That was when I truly understood that the best revenge wasn't destruction. It was indifference. Exactly 10 years after that night in the kitchen, I sat down with a journalist named Sophie Chen, and I told her my story. Not the vengeful version. Not the "he said I was crazy" version. But the real version, the complicated, nuanced, honest version about what it means to love someone who's incapable of loving you back, and what it takes to rebuild yourself after they've systematically deconstructed you. The article, published in a major magazine, went viral. It was shared 1 million times. Women everywhere recognized themselves in my story. Men everywhere recognized themselves in Daniel's patterns. Therapists began using it as a teaching tool. Lawyers referenced it in abuse cases. But what surprised me most was how many messages I received from people saying the same thing. I thought I was crazy too. I established a nonprofit foundation. I wrote a book. I started speaking at conferences about emotional abuse and recovery. And every single time, I told people the same thing. You're not crazy. But crazy doesn't plan revenge this perfectly. Clarity does. Strength does. Truth does. And those are things that are available to anyone willing to look for them. On a quiet Sunday morning, 10 years after I first walked into my kitchen and saw my marriage collapse, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't vindicated, exactly, though I had been. I wasn't satisfied with revenge, though I had achieved it. I wasn't even particularly proud of the elaborate scheme I'd orchestrated, though it had been elegant in its way. What I felt was simply free. Free from the need for his validation. Free from the fear of his judgment. Free from the burden of trying to convince him, or myself, that I was anything other than exactly who I needed to be. I'd started dating someone, a quiet man named Marcus who worked in environmental conservation and had learned, through his own painful experiences, that love should feel like peace, not like war. I'd reconnected with Claire, my best friend, and we were planning a trip to Italy for her 50th birthday. I'd reconciled with my mother, and we'd actually apologized to each other, something I never thought would happen. I'd built a life that wasn't defined by trauma or revenge or the need to be right. It was just a good life. A quiet life. A life where I woke up without dread and went to sleep without nightmares. That morning, as I sat with my tea, I thought about Daniel. Not with anger or triumph, but with something closer to pity. He'd spent his life convinced that the way to make himself powerful was to make other people small. He'd never understood that real power came from making other people strong. He was still in prison, now in his 60s, serving the last of his sentence. By all accounts, he'd become a model prisoner, quiet, compliant, no trouble to anyone. I wondered sometimes if he'd finally figured it out. If somewhere in the silence of his cell, he'd realized that the woman he'd tried to convince was crazy had actually been the sanest person in the room all along. But honestly, it didn't matter. Because I'd moved on from needing him to figure anything out. I'd moved on from needing anything from him at all. That was the real victory. Not his destruction, but my freedom. Not his shame, but my peace. The last text message I ever received from anyone connected to Daniel came from Madeline, now 5 years into her work at the nonprofit helping fraud victims. She'd sent me an article about a woman she'd helped, a woman named Jennifer who'd left her abusive husband and started a small business. She kept saying she thought she was crazy, Madeline had written. I told her what you told me. She asked if that was true, if she really wasn't crazy. And I realized, for the first time, that I believed it. For me, for you, for Jennifer, for everyone. We were never crazy. We were just loved by people who didn't know how to love. I never responded to that text, but I saved it. Not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of transformation. Because that's what this story really was, when you stripped away the revenge and the vindication and the righteous anger. It was the story of a woman who'd been told she was crazy and had chosen, instead, to become conscious. Who'd been told she was broken and had chosen, instead, to become stronger. Who'd been told she was nothing without a man and had chosen, instead, to become everything. And that, I realized as I finished my tea and watched the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, was a story worth telling. Not because it ended in destruction. But because it ended in peace. I spent years believing my voice didn't matter. That my truth was less important than his narrative. That my survival depended on his validation. But sitting here now, 10 years free from the man who tried to convince me I was crazy, I know different. Respect isn't something you ask permission to deserve, it's something you claim when you're brave enough to stop shrinking. Your worth isn't negotiable. Not by a charming narcissist. Not by people who believed his lies first. Not by anyone. My silence almost destroyed me. But my silence also saved me. I learned that patience isn't weakness, it's a different kind of power. The power to gather evidence. The power to wait for truth to surface. The power to let someone's own lies become their undoing. If you're being gaslit into invisibility right now, hear me, your boundaries aren't difficult. Your need to protect yourself isn't selfish. Your survival is extraordinary. And it starts the moment you decide to write your own ending instead of letting someone else hold the pen. Share this story with someone who's been convinced they're crazy. Tell them they're not. Tell them the revolution begins quietly, in therapy sessions, in journaled truths, in the decision to believe yourself when no one else does. Subscribe and hit that bell. Because there are thousands of stories like mine, and each one is proof your worth was never the question. You were only ever waiting to remember it. Welcome to your next chapter.